Well, I guess do something. Well, don't pursue pleasure in and of itself as your primary aim, and I think that's one of the errors that people who get into difficulties with drugs do. And they pursue the euphoric effects of drugs, and that often leads to uh, various sorts of problems that people find difficult.
Welcome to this episode of Growth Island. My name is Friis and I'm your host as always. Today we're gonna talk about psychedelics, something that's a lot in the news and there's more research pouring into that. And for that, I found a professor, as I always prefer to do. And not just a professor, an emeritus professor. And for those of you who are not in the academic world, that means they're like at the top, they have been there for many years and they're really experienced. So this is not someone that just became a professor. And just to say, becoming a professor takes a lot of work, takes many years, and is kind of like the top. So all of the management consultants, these are like the equity partners in the firm. So the top within academia. So I got Dr. Wayne Hall in. He is a professor at the University of Queensland. He's been advising the WHO about health effects of cannabis use, the effectiveness of drug substance treatment, and a bunch of other stuff. He's also a lot into the ethics of different studies. And then he started looking more into psychedelics. So Wayne, thank you so much for coming on.
You're welcome.
So if we just start, how did you get into looking further into psychedelics?
Well, it's a bit outside my usual range of interests. As you mentioned, cannabis has been at the centre of my research interests, but I've also looked at alcohol, opiates, and cigarettes. And I guess psychedelics became a sort of COVID project because we went into lockdown here, and I was wondering how I was going to spend my time. I just retired from full-time academic work, and so I was looking around for interesting subjects. I'd noticed that there was a lot of interest in psychedelic drugs amongst people who were promoting medical uses of cannabis. I read Michael Pollan's book, How to Change Your Mind, and became quite interested in, started reading widely in the history of psychedelic drugs, particularly in the early 50s and 60s, why that research was abandoned, and then read about the recent clinical trials of psilocybin and MDMA for depression and post-traumatic stress disorder, respectively.
Yeah. So if we just quickly say, what are psychedelics for someone that's like, I know what cannabis is, I know what alcohol is, what are psychedelics?
Well, they're not a single class of drugs. There's a wide variety of very different drugs which produce fairly profound changes in perception and thinking. Uh, they're often described uh, as producing the sorts of effects that we only experience often in dreams or when we're delirious, that is seriously ill. But in this case, the effects are ones that most people can distinguish from regular daily wakeful states, and they typically tend to be reasonably short-lived. They are often seen as producing very profound mystical type experiences that people report. So they're an interesting class of drugs. I guess the classic exemplars have been LSD, psilocybin or magic mushrooms, and MDMA, which is not often included in the classes, is one, or ecstasy as it's known and by its street name. Those are the sorts of drugs. Older ones are mescaline, ayahuasca, which are the sort of plant-based drugs from the peyote cactus and a Brazilian vine. So there's a wide variety of plants and pure drugs that produce these effects.
And one of the ones that I've heard a lot about is our Ayahuasca
Mhm.
from Peru, where that's just like spreading around the world that people go and participate in these ceremonies. And I mostly hear the good stories, but I think that's also the ones that are being reported as it's still illegal in many places. So I'm quite curious about like who shouldn't be doing this and what do we actually know from a research perspective. I'm personally very curious, but I don't dare to judge it before another 10 years when we have proper research. I don't want to, there's certain things I don't want to experiment with and certain things that I'm more willing to. And this seems to be, at least my understanding, a category that can be mind opening, but potentially also really dangerous. What's the status on the research and what you found so far?
Well, there's not a lot of work on that particular drug. I mean, as you say, there's enormous amounts of drug tourism. There's people setting themselves up as shamans who put people through these drug experiences. Lots of claims made and lots of positive experiences. I mean, there have been some bad cases of people dying in the course of these events or experiences. I mean, on the face of it, the typical experience is people vomit profusely for initially. So the initial effects of these drugs are not very pleasant, but then people report having visions and experiences and having their lives transformed. Well, I guess, I'm old enough to remember the psychedelics the first time around in the late 60s and early 70s. They were everywhere when I started at university as an undergraduate. And they were heavily promoted, and there was a lot of people using them and a lot of claims made for them. And certainly I knew a lot of people who didn't go crazy, but ended up believing pretty absurd things and following some pretty doubtful, morally doubtful gurus, such as Richard Alpert, who became Baba Ram Das, Carlos Castaneda, the Bhagwan, who led the Rajneeshis, and of course Timothy Leary and Hunter S. Thompson. So there were a lot of crazy things said and a lot of people misled. And I think one of the big concerns about these drugs is that people who, I think when used under clinical supervision in the ways in which they have been very carefully by people doing clinical trials, that can be safe. But I think they're very much open to abuse if people of morally doubtful character get involved. And I mean, the most high profile example of that, of course, is Charles Manson, who used LSD in the late 60s in California to induce people to commit some pretty horrific crimes. But he was a career criminal with a long history of violence and so on. But he misused the drugs in those particular ways. And it's not hard to find other examples. We had a very similar cult of around LSD in Australia in the 70s and 80s. So people get involved in this, become quite inflated in their views of themselves and their importance, and attract disciples and followers and form cults around themselves, which often involve the abuse of their members. So I think they're often the risks that we run if these drugs became widely used without appropriate care and supervision and used by people who may not have the best of motives.
What are some of the results we're seeing in regards how it can actually be useful?
Well, we've got clinical trials being done by some pretty serious researchers in the US, the UK, and in other countries of Switzerland as well. And in the clinical trials to date, with reasonably small numbers of patients, highly selected, I mean, a lot of these trials have excluded patients with more complicated psychiatric disorders in order to minimize the risk of misadventure. But in that sort of setting, the results have been quite encouraging. In that, in the case of psilocybin, people have reported pretty immediate and very substantial reductions in depressive symptoms that have often resisted treatment with more conventional treatments. And in a small number of cases, these patients have been followed up for over a year or more, and their benefits appear to persist. So for that reason, the Food and Drug Administration in the US has given these drugs expedited approval so that they can be trialled. And they look like, if the results hold up in larger studies, they may well be approved. Very similar findings for MDMA, but in that case, the treatment, the condition being treated is post-traumatic stress disorder rather than depression. There's also smaller studies, less well controlled, of a variety of other psychedelic drugs being used to treat addictions and other more common forms of disorders such as anxiety disorders and so on. So a lot of enthusiasm, a lot of excitement about these drugs, which is understandable given that we really haven't had a lot of new drugs introduced into psychiatric practice for probably 10 or more years. So that's the reason for the excitement. I guess the concern has been expressed just in an article in the last day or two in the Journal of the American Psychiatric Association, saying that the concern is that the enthusiasm for these drugs may well get well ahead of our knowledge of which patients are most likely to respond and how to mitigate or minimize the risk of serious adverse events.
I had another professor on from a top university in the US who looked into ketamine. He had reached many years into his profession of studying different things within depression and something. He was just like, we need a new innovation. There gotta be something else that's working better. And he saw with
Mm.
severe depression that ketamine was extremely effective. But one of the
Yeah, I mean,
challenges was it's
mm,
generic drug, so there's not that much. It's hard to find the funding. He found, I think it
yeah,
was Johnson that took it and made a nasal spray because they could patent the delivery mechanism, and that was being it wasn't as effective as how you could do ketamine administered with a psychiatrist, but that was being pushed a bit more and still a decent solution, but not the best solution.
yeah. I mean, ketamine's a good example. I mean, as you just said, it's a now a generic drug because it's out of patent. It's been used as an anaesthetic agent rather than as a treatment for depression. And there's probably a lot more research that's been done on that, demonstrating quite a very similar to psilocybin, a reasonably rapid and substantial improvement in clinical symptoms. The big drawback with ketamine is that the effects tend not to persist, so patients often need to be retreated. And so I think one of the reasons for the interest in psilocybin is that's not the case, or doesn't appear to be the case, at least in the early trials, in that patients are reporting improvements which needs to be sustained for up to 6 months and more. So, um, I guess that's a major part of the reason for the interest in these drugs, as you said, that the drugs, the SSRIs, the selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors that were introduced in the 90s are now getting plenty of bad press. They're not as effective as they were hyped up to be initially. And there's downsides with the use of these drugs because people have to take them daily for long periods of time, and it's often difficult to stop taking them without experiencing withdrawal symptoms.
Mm.
So it's understandable why there's an interest in looking at more effective antidepressant agents, and that's a major reason why there's so much interest, particularly in psilocybin.
Have you had a chance to look at any literature if there is anything on microdosing? Because we hear a lot in Silicon Valley and many high performers that are like microdosing different things. And I have a friend who did it, and
Yeah.
that didn't work out well for him. His eyes, he just seemed off. But then at the same time, you hear many stories about people that find it highly effective and so on.
Yeah, I mean, the difficulty with that is you're taking subtherapeutic doses, discriminating between that and placebo. I know there's been some studies done with people who claim all sorts of benefits from microdosing, where they're given the drugs under double-blind conditions, and they really can't distinguish between the placebo and the active agent. And I guess that would be the challenge with that. I think it's sort of a larger question that how should we evaluate new therapeutics? And the tradition has been to require evidence from randomized controlled trials, and that's been a challenge for the psychedelics because they produce such obvious effects. It's difficult to disguise that from the patient that they've received a psychedelic rather than a placebo. That's less of an issue for microdosing. So, I mean, it's probably more amenable to research for that reason. I'm not aware at the moment that there's enough out there to draw conclusions other than the sort of anecdotes and patient testimonials that we're receiving about them. I mean,
I
I guess they're
guess,
the sort of hippie types of testimonials when we've just been through similar claims made about hydroxychloroquine and ivermectin in the case of treating COVID. I think we have to be wary about people telling us about the benefits because it's easy to be misled unless you've got evidence from better controlled trials.
I guess it's also hard to find the like funding for it because there's so many, you could say, more important things that we want to figure out in the world. How can we treat depression? Then how can we make someone perform a little bit extra? I
Well,
guess
I
it's
think
not.
there's an interest in doing trials on depression, and in fact, the Australian government has recently allocated $15 million for clinical trials of these drugs. So I think the fact that the trials that have been done to date, largely with philanthropic money,
Yeah.
have produced reasonably positive results has made it easier for people to get funding. One from new for-profit companies, because there's a number of for-profit companies that are now funding clinical trials of not so much the specific pharmaceutical, but often the way in which it's been produced or synthesized.
Hmm.
So you've got compass pathways, for example, that's been prepared to do that. And I think there will be more government interest. I think the fact that the FDA has given a sort of advanced approval for clinical trials of these drugs will make it a lot easier for people to get funding from more traditional funding sources.
But you also think
So
with
I think,
microdosing, where it's not for therapy, but it's for top performance.
yeah. Well, I think there you might well expect it to be philanthropic funding for a while, given that it's not treating a particular medical condition. But I think some of the groups that have been doing work on the clinical uses have been looking at research on microdosing. So we might well expect to see some work done on that as well.
Are there any specific groups where you would say they need to be extremely or extra careful about testing out microdosing or something else?
Well, I think people with psychotic illnesses or symptoms, psychotic symptoms, would probably be well advised to stay away from these drugs. I mean, when I was an undergraduate, I worked in a vacation job as a psychiatric nurse, and that was back in the early 70s when these drugs were out and about, widely used, and we certainly saw individuals come through the acute psychiatry ward, people with schizophrenia who'd had a bad time using these particular drugs. And it's interesting that the early researchers, Osman and Hoffer, who did the work in Saskatchewan in the 1950s, their primary interest was in schizophrenia, and they did some work, gave the drug to some patients with that disorder, but ended up recommending against using LSD in patients with psychosis. I think the same would probably be the case with people with severe forms of depression, other than the psilocybin, because some severe forms of depression may well involve people having psychotic experiences. So it'd have to be, I mean, not that one shouldn't ever do it, because I know there are clinical trials being planned for the use of psilocybin in the treatment of bipolar disorder. But it would be something that would be done with caution, and before we started doing that routinely in clinical practice.
Where do you think this is going to be in 10 years' time?
That's hard to know. I mean, one could think of an optimistic scenario and less optimistic scenario. The optimistic scenario would be that the clinical trials, the larger clinical trials are done, the results prove as positive as the early results. These drugs are introduced into clinical practice, people develop experience in their use, it becomes clearer which patients will benefit from them, and they become a routine part of clinical practice. So that's sort of the optimistic outcome. And I guess the worry I have is that we end up replicating a lot of the silliness and absurdity of the 60s and 70s, when these drugs are widely used outside medical supervision, and we see misadventures, people dying, perhaps not expecting that to be a common event directly from the drug, but if people become psychotic and do dangerous things while intoxicated, they could have misadventures or end up killing themselves. It doesn't take many events of that sort to bring a drug into disrepute, and so that's the worry that we could have there. Or if we see a lot of these drugs being abused by cultists and would-be self-trained shamans, then we might see much more restrictions on their use, which make it harder to use these drugs in clinical services. So I guess it's not clear to me where we're going to go, but I guess they're sort of best case and worst case scenarios. And one would hope for something in between there, where the drugs might not be quite as miraculous in their effects as claimed now, but there clearly will be patient groups who benefit from their use. And we're able to use the drugs in ways that minimise the risk of misadventure and maximise the benefits that patients receive.
Why is it that we had so many years where this was not part of academia? It kind of disappeared.
I think I mean, obviously the fact that these drugs were illegal made it a bit harder, but not impossible, because there was research continued in the US till as late as 1979. which is nearly 10 years after the drugs, psychedelics were included in the Controlled Substances Act. And work was done in Switzerland in the 1990s, despite the fact that these drugs were illegal under international drug control treaties. So it wasn't impossible to do research. I think there was a lot of suspicion of these drugs and of people who might get involved in doing research on them because of the history of the 60s and 70s. So certainly people looking back at that period said there was strong advice given to younger researchers coming through that you just stay away from researching these drugs because it puts your reputation at risk. So I think there was that. And, and I think the other is it's not that easy to do research on these drugs, clinical trials, randomized controlled clinical trials. I think that was one of the other reasons why research wasn't done. And of course, you've already mentioned the fact that the pharmaceutical companies weren't interested because these drugs were out of patent. So there wasn't the incentive to fund clinical trials.
Makes sense. And I think it's different what circles you're in. Sometimes people are like, it's so bad. The farmer like only want to support these different things. But I also come from a business background, so I very much understand they need to get a return. And I think it's a challenge with many things that are good is that it's harder to get the funding. There needs to be governmental funding and so on. Same with food, forest walking and so on. In Japan, that's bigger and so on. But many of the things that you can patent, it's harder to get the really good science on how it actually works and if it works.
Yeah, I mean, it doesn't just apply to drugs, it applies to psychological interventions as well. That's a point that a former colleague of mine, Gavin Andrews, as a psychiatrist, made, I think, 20 years ago, that the drug lithium, for example, it was very difficult to get funding for clinical trials there. It's a drug which is very effective in treating bipolar disorder, and particularly the symptoms of mania. And that was because it was a naturally occurring salt that no drug company could patent. But it also applies to sort of behavioural therapies and cognitive therapies that were developed. Most of the research has been done by publicly funded researchers, and getting that into clinical practice has been a challenge.
Yeah. You also did a lot of studies into cannabis.
Yes. Well, both recreational cannabis use and medical use.
What are some of the interesting findings there? And I can imagine as well for your academic career, now you talked about looking into magic mushrooms and so on could be dangerous. That must have been the same with cannabis.
Well, not really. I mean, in the early career, it was mainly around the adverse health effects. So there's a lot of interest in funding that. Less interest in funding research on medical uses. But I guess one of the advantages about being an emeritus professor and retired is that you don't much care about reputation and so on. It's you can live on whatever intellectual capital you've acquired to follow your interests more than might have been the case when you were dependent on funding. So to answer your question about cannabis, I mean, there clearly is evidence of medical benefits, but I think they've been oversold, and I think medical cannabis has primarily been used as a Trojan horse for legalisation in both Canada and the US, and it's being now used in the same way in Europe and Australia and other countries. So the legalisation advocates have recognised that the best way to get cannabis legalised is to do it in the guise of medical treatment, where you have it, you legalise the prescription of cannabis, basically in the absence of lots of evidence of efficacy and safety. And once you do that, it becomes a lot easier to persuade people that cannabis ought to be legalised. After all, if it's a medicine, it means it must be safe and effective, and so it can't hurt you. There's also, I guess, a lot of the meme about it being a natural herb, and so we know natural products can't hurt you. Things like arsenic and asbestos and tobacco, they're harmless because they're all natural. So I think there's been a lot of overselling of medical cannabis, and I think one of the interesting downsides of legalisation is that the incentives to do the clinical research on medical uses largely disappears once the drug is legal, because why would you bother funding clinical trials when people can buy it? Any adult can purchase it. And that's what I think we've seen in the US and Canada as well, that there hasn't been any increase in serious clinical research after the legalization of cannabis in those places.
So just to understand, so the studies that has come out about cannabis having positive effects and so on, you think most of those studies are not big enough sample sizes, the quality is not good enough, or you're taking the results and like making them bigger than they actually are, or
A bit of all of those. I mean, you start with the case where I think the evidence is strongest is around epilepsy and cannabidiol, the sort of non-intoxicating cannabinoid that's found in the cannabis plant. I think there's pretty good evidence that it reduces seizure frequency in children with epileptic syndromes, and it's probably going to prove to be more generally useful as an anti-epileptic. In the case of things like nausea and vomiting, which was one of the indications for which THC or tetrahydrocannabinol has been approved for nearly 30 years, it's better than placebo, but not by much. And there are a lot better drugs around nowadays than that was the case in the 1980s when the very early trials were done. If we look at age-related wasting, well, people don't develop age-related wasting these days because we have effective antiretroviral drugs. So those were two indications that are often brought up. And in both cases, well, probably stronger for the anti-nausea effects than for the age-related wasting. The effects are not particularly strong. And in the other case of chronic pain, I've been involved in doing some very big meta-analyses of clinical trials there. I mean, THC does have an effect on pain, but it's pretty modest, and there's not much difference between cannabis and placebo. And we estimated from our trials that you needed to treat sort of 20 odd patients with THC to get one who had a substantial clinical benefit from using cannabis for chronic pain. But you wouldn't know that from the claims made about these drugs in the sort of I guess the popular literature about their medical uses. They're sold as basic panaceas that can treat just about anything and everything, including COVID. And we have all sorts of claims made about cannabis as a treatment for COVID during the recent pandemic. So I think we've got overselling here, and there's been a surprising lack of critical attention to these claims made by the media. I mean, if a pharmaceutical company was making the sort of claims about cannabis, about its products as people have been making about medical cannabis, there'd be an uproar. But because it's a naturally occurring herb, people have been prepared to wave it through. And so I think there's also been, I've noticed, a double standard in that the evidence that people are prepared to accept of the benefits of cannabis is much, much weaker than the sort of evidence they demand if we're talking about adverse effects. When it comes to looking at adverse effects, they suddenly become super skeptics. Oh, you can't draw causal inferences from observational data, they'll tell you. But that's exactly what they do when it comes to a lot of the putative benefits of medical cannabis.
what do you think is one of the biggest challenges in the health space and with different claims and so on? Because it is a jungle to figure out like what is making the like what is actually making a difference, right? And it might be
Yeah,
making a 10% increase, but you could do something else that makes a 20% increase, right? Or decrease. So
yeah, yeah. I mean, randomized controlled trials are the most reliable way of doing that. There hasn't been a lot of interest in that in the case of medical cannabis. Well, for both reasons, from the point of view of the pharmaceutical industry, with the exception of the cannabidiol CBD, there's not been a lot of interest in doing clinical trials of THC-based cannabis products. There's more of it now, but lots of that's been done with government funding, and that's largely been in response to patient demand for access to these drugs. So governments have been prepared to fund clinical trials, and of course, there'll be some time before we see the results of those trials. I'm aware that trials that have been done here in Australia that have just not really supported the sorts of claims made by advocates, and of course, the media have largely ignored those. So it's very easy to get media focus on the benefits or the alleged benefits of medical cannabis. There's not a lot less interest in what we learn from clinical trials that look more critically at the evidence.
Interesting. What are some of the things that you've seen that works really well against someone that has an addiction? Because I looked into some of all the literature that you wrote, and that's something you touched several times.
Well, it depends on what sort of addiction we're talking about. And I guess in the case of the opioids, the heroin and so on, there's a pretty large literature showing that opioid assisted therapy, that is giving people a longer acting opioid like methadone or buprenorphine via the oral route, is a good way to help them get their lives back in order, to remove themselves from the illicit market, from having to engage in drug dealing or criminal behaviour to fund their drug use, and also provides people with an opportunity to rehabilitate, to get an education that they might have missed out on, to repair relations with families, get employment, and get their lives back together. For a lot of the other drugs, for alcohol, I mean, there are various drugs that can assist people in maintaining abstinence, but none of them are fabulously effective. Those are things like naltrexone for alcohol, acamprosate, and there's been a lot of investment, particularly in the US, from the drug research centres there in funding clinical trials of drug treatments for addiction that have largely been pretty disappointing in their results. In the case of nicotine dependence, we know that nicotine replacement can help people get through withdrawal. There's encouraging evidence for the value of e-cigarettes in helping people quit for the same sort of reason. It's much closer to smoking than chewing gum or putting on a patch. Not very good with the stimulant drugs like methamphetamine and cocaine. Not for want of trying. There's been enormous numbers of clinical trials of potential agents to treat those disorders, but not a lot of success. And we do have psychological treatments which are very helpful for people with those problems, but often it's difficult to get people to engage in treatment and to stay in treatment long enough to benefit. In the case of cannabis, we don't, I mean, I think it's worth making the point that people do become dependent on cannabis. I think that's underappreciated as a risk of cannabis use. And it looks a lot like alcohol dependence in the sense that once people get caught up in daily use and it goes on for long periods of time, they often find it very hard to stop. And the sort of treatment that's most effective is often involves pretty major changes in one's life. Is one of the things that sustains both alcohol dependence and cannabis dependence is having lots of friends who use alcohol and cannabis. And often it's much easier to change your friends than it is to stop using these drugs if your social network is one in which they're widely available and the use is encouraged and engaged in by lots of people around you. So no magic cures there. I mean, we know what can help, but it's a lot of treatments that have been around for a long time. I mean, obviously groups like Alcoholics Anonymous, Narcotics Anonymous are sort of self-help groups that help people remain abstinent, and that involves, I guess, developing a new social network of people who don't use drugs as a way to support your abstinence.
Got it. When you got very far in your career, many people, like, not everyone gets to become a professor or me to a professor and get it so far as you do. What do you think are some of the things that got you to where you are today?
Oh, lots of luck. I think that's, one has to be honest about that. I mean, I got into drug and alcohol not as a first choice, but because I was teaching undergraduate medical students, which was a pretty unrewarding life, because the medical students typically had the view, what's psychology got to do with medicine? They had a fairly mechanistic view of their job as sort of mechanics of the human body, repairing it and treating it with drugs, and what did they need to know about people? So I was doing that for a while, and a job came up, was advertised to do research on alcohol and other drugs. Well, I thought I'll give that a try and see what that's like. Can't be any worse than what I'm doing now. And I got into it, and Found it much more engaging and interesting than I thought, and I ended up spending, I guess, the better part of 12 years running a large research centre. Initially doing a lot of work on heroin and then cannabis and amphetamines and alcohol. I then took a break for a while and moved into the area of ethics, as you mentioned, public policy and ethics, particularly around new biotechnologies, new genetics, neuroscience, and so on, and ended up drifting back into the addiction area because a lot of work in neuroscience and genetics has been done on addiction, and trying to think about what the cash value of that research was. How useful could it be? And I guess I've just been fortunate that interesting opportunities have come up as I've done work and taught, and I've just taken the best of the opportunities that presented themselves and had a lot of fun and worked with a lot of bright young people who make life more interesting and more productive. So it's not just something you do on your own. It's a bit like drug use. It's something you do in the company of other people who've got similar interests.
I think that's the first time I heard academia being like drug use, but I like it. Cool. What it sounds like it's been a good ride, Wayne. What if you had to give three advice for the listeners about how to live a happy, healthy, and meaningful life from your experience? What would that be?
Well, I guess do something. Well, don't pursue pleasure in and of itself as your primary aim, and I think that's one of the errors that people who get into difficulties with drugs do. They pursue the euphoric effects of drugs, and that often leads to uh, various sorts of problems that people find difficult. I guess finding a rewarding career or work, if you can work on things that you enjoy and interest you, you're well in front. Even better if those things make a difference to the lives of other people. I mean, these are sort of fairly banal pieces of advice um, but I think they're ones that have worked for me. And take the whatever opportunities life presents itself to you and make the most of them. I think that's certainly what I've done.
Fantastic. Wayne, thank you so much for sharing. And last question, where can people find out more about you?
I guess you Google me. There's various websites that the university still has up, which has got publications on it, and there are a variety of interviews that I've done on various topics over time, which I think you can probably get through the web. Things on cannabis policy. In fact, I think there's an interview that I did, which was on my career, my career in the addiction field, that was done some 4 or 5 years ago, which I think is probably up on the web on the journal Addiction. So there's various ways you can find out about me, and I guess if you look at Google Scholar, that'll throw up a lot of my publications, which I've generally aimed to write in ways that are accessible to an audience other than my peers. And you've got to write for your peers, but I think it's also important to write articles that for a broader audience of people who might be interested in the topic that you're working on.
Yeah. Is there anything that I didn't ask you that I should have asked you about in this talk?
No, I think we've covered all the ground.
Fantastic. Well, Wayne, thank you so much for coming on the show. I really appreciate it.
You're welcome.